Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Man at YouTube with another airbrush review. This was lent to me by a friend. It is an Artlogic AC320. I think it is a 0.2 millimeter. It's got a small cup. More or less the rest of the body, I assume, is exactly the same as a Hysing or King Max, or pretty much what a Neo or your Spa Max would be like. So we're going to pull it apart. Now the problem my friend has with this is there's a bit of resistance on the needle, so I'm going to give it a clean and a lubrication. I believe lubrication is fine enough. That needle was a bit hard to pull out. As we are exploring my friend's airbrush, we're just going to see if this brand is alright and how does a mini cup holds out. So far it's in pretty good nick, and it's pulling apart and utilizes the exact same threads and components as everything else we're fairly familiar with. So that's not too bad at all. It's got a bit of dirt and grime and crud inside, so we might give it a bit of a whirl in the ultrasonic cleaner. Straight off the bat, I like how the very bottom of the cup funnels like the newer Spa Max airbrushes. That is really good. It is more or less electroplated brass, and you've got the air coming out as well as the paint, and a bit of lacquer thinner. You can see some of the dirt coming out, not too much. So that is the internals cleaned out. Not too bad. There must have been a tiny bit of paint that got caught just behind the washer around the paint cup. So as usual, we give the needle a clean, making sure that we're free of any raised paint or debris. The taper of the needle is very rough feeling. I think that's just the machining. That is almost like it was lathed poorly or something. Everything on this airbrush is pretty much original. We had the airline washer come off. That's not too important. It just seals when you put the cap on. Sometimes you get a few bubbles and whatnot. As long as the washer behind there is fine, that's okay. We normally lubricate the thread, and that pretty much bypasses that and allows solvents to clean out these rigs. We'll give this a bit of a soak. Wipe out the internals with a Q-tip, which for some reason is not so easy to get out. But when I'm teaching people to getting into airbrush, if you've never used an airbrush before, and as we're doing so in this video, if this is the first time you're watching an airbrush video, if you've seen a few, you're buying another one, wishing to just improve your skills a bit, or you want to learn from scratch, what I always teach is be familiar with the mechanical breakdown of your airbrush. Look at the disassembly instructions, pull apart to all these components and reassemble again, upping times until you're super familiar as far as you can with this. Then what we're going to do is lubricate from this point backwards using petroleum jelly, and doing so in an order that in the event you pull the needle or the needle moves and there's any paint that gets backwards, it's not going to stick between working metal parts and just work absolutely ideally. Now in our assembly, pulling apart's not too hard. Assembly, there's just a few things to take note of. The most two careful parts or components to clean is the needle and the nozzle. From what I've seen of the machining of the needle and nozzle, these components will probably be very worthwhile to replace quickly. The nozzle with the little wrench only needs to be tightened with one finger and only a little bit. If you over tighten, being made of brass, it's going to shear off and leave the thread inside the airbrush. If this does occur, there is a video on this channel about how to overcome that. Now we crack open the petroleum jelly and we're going to swab all of our threads and the internals or the internal walls, as so that when the metal components are passing each other, they don't get stuck. You don't over thread or over tighten the actual threads because there's a bit of jelly blocking it. And another component that I found that's a bit different to the hyacinth, the cheaper airbrush will have a large brass cylinder held by a nut there, which does not need to be removed for any reason. Some of the slightly better budget airbrushes will have that all moulded in. So that's just something to be wary of. When you look down all the way to the back, you'll see a circular nut head, or sorry, a bolt head with a hole all the way through to guide the needle, and you'll have a flathead blade indent. You can stick a flathead screwdriver in there, remove that bolt, remove a washer, replace it and clean it. Be very careful when you do that, and don't do it too often, because that is pretty much what separates the paint here and going backwards. That washer also eventually goes off over time, but that would be many years of use, as well as many washers or submerging or ultrasonic cleans in solvents. So our internals are absolutely lubricated. We're going to start assembling. First, we've got the trigger. When you pull back, you release paint, and we'll see how the rest of the mechanism works. When you push down, you're pushing a plunger that pushes this solenoid and allows air to enter the airbrush. We don't want paint going down the airline, as you're going to have intermittent airflow issues. So just a little bit of lubrication, and this is one of the trickiest parts. We want to get that little brass tip right in the air output line. It's very loose on this particular model. It's a bit tricky to control. That was a very tight fit. Once it was over the hole, it had to be snapped in. But you'll know it's in because you'll actually see the brass nipple coming through the airline. This means we can slightly grease that up. And this dimple in, make sure it's able to retract in and out freely. Don't block those two holes, as that's where the air comes out, or stick anything inside this assembly. This assembly fits on all airbrushes. It's generally universal, and at this point should push down very freely and spring up without any problem or delay. Now we've got our tongue. This pushes back our spring assembly. I like it lubed. It does not necessarily have to be lubed, but it's in the shape of an S, and that tiny hook hooks on the very back of that part. This little piece is also a bit of practice to get in. A little practice, you'll get it. Now we lay down the airbrush very, very carefully. This assembly is the next lot. We have 3 components: the plunger, the spring, and the housing. And this is what makes it all go backwards and forwards. The tolerance is quite looser than I'm used to. We'll grease it up just to lessen the tolerance a bit. You will get grease on your fingers, that's just the habit of it, though even being a solvent, it isn't going to hurt you by getting on your skin or whatnot. It's pretty safe. We grease up the thread here. And the plunger heading first with the spring sandwiching it together. We screw it in, making sure the tongue is flat up against the trigger. Now, as I pull it back, there should be no resistance whatsoever. Same with pushing down. And we see that this component goes backwards and forwards. Last is our needle. We want to hold it near the pointy ends and only lubricate the back end. Putting it through very, very slowly. Sometimes you may want to put the back end first to make sure there's no resistance, which there wasn't. And even though there is a little resistance around the washer near the paint cup, it's slid in very, very easily. Bit of lubricant here. The needle nut goes on. And it should go technically backwards and forwards easily. There we go. The tongue was not set in straight, so when we pulled back we had issues. Now we don't, and the needle goes back with the needle nut attached without any issues. Last but not least, we have our soaked crown. Grease that up. Plop it on very, very careful, and we give it a tad of a rub down in thinner to remove any grease. Going to flush some thinner out and do some tests with some lines. Generally the tolerances are not great, but if it's the only affordable airbrush available to you, not too bad. I would not grab it if it's over 40 USD, as there are better models out there you can get via eBay or other dealers such as Hysing or the other brands. But we'll see if the small cup and its nozzle diameter is all that's cracked up to be. We have it hooked up. Has a tad of a whistle. That's probably because the washer fell out. We'll put a bit of thinner and see if that affects it any yodel. We've got thinner coming out immediately, so we will quickly adjust it and make sure that the needle is up against the nozzle. Nothing's coming out, so we've got a tight seal. That is excellent. A little bit of jet bubble. That's when you put your finger up against the nozzle, pull the trigger back, and we mix all the internals. Any remnant paint. Flow is quite excellent. And it empties the cup very, very quickly, so we don't have any clog issues. The trigger flows backwards nicely, flows down. Because there's not a lot of mechanical tolerance, that the whole rig is just loose as hell. Generally, putting paint through it and not doing a proper clean nor lubricating it is pretty much a sentence to clog it immediately. Got some a little bit of crappy pre-thin paint, which I don't know if I like the idea of these mini cups, but we will see. We'll paint some lines, try to get them as thin as possible, as thin as a pencil. It sprays very, very smoothly. At this point, I'm very surprised. So what's already not a great airbrush, just a slight amount of tuning. It's very, very sharp, very, very neat. We're getting very fine lines out of it. And it colours in large surfaces easy enough. Bit of a splatter problem, but that's why you always start spraying off the surface, go on. Or it's still splattering a bit. Probably, look, replace the needle. I did notice that it did have those chamfered, or not chamfered, those laved lines. That was a problem, and that's going to give you some issues. So if you buy a Artlogic, it sprays okay. It's not a problem. Replace the needle immediately with some needles off eBay or somewhere else that's not the same place as these guys, especially if it comes one of those clear tubes with the red end, or those deals where they're 5 for a few dollars. And you should be absolutely fine, no issues whatsoever. I don't mind it at all. I might consider get myself one for fine work and playing around more. But I think the proof is in the pudding, and these tiny lines are very, very nice. Just make sure to lubricate it and you won't have any issues whatsoever. We're going to clear it out. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until next time, stay tuned for further content. We post once or twice a week on YouTube. Keep a look on the McConnor Man on Facebook for further content. We do work in progresses, other big news that may be in the Gundam scale model world, new releases, all that sort of thing. A Patreon if you're so inclined to support what we do here. I don't put a paywall in front of any content, and I'm quickly discovering that a small cup is a bit tricky to flush out, but that's only probably because I haven't dealt with it before. Shall catch you all later. Happy modelling, and don't forget, regularly maintain your airbrush, pull apart and put together your airbrush regularly, spray lines so you know what the ultimate and optimal condition and effects of your airbrush are. Practice regularly, and the more you use your rig, the more you will be comfortable and spray better through practice. If you come across any problems, holler out. We can help you to troubleshoot and pretty much learn and grow together. Catch you guys next time. I also forgot, with the needle, because it's rough as hell, if you're daring enough, use some 800, 1000, 1500 grit sandpaper, and you can polish it to be quite smooth and effective, and use that needle before you replace it. If you're not comfortable with it, practice on it anyway before you get a fresh needle.